Facebook's co-founder, he writes an op-ed to the New York Times calling for the breakup of Facebook. Oh, good man. Beginning with Windows Insider builds this summer, Microsoft will ship a full Linux kernel inside Windows 10. Well, who would have thunk that? Ubuntu 19.10 codename has been revealed. Is this the most obscure name for an Ubuntu release ever? Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella comes to the Red Hat Summit. He announces a new Microsoft Red Hat partnership. And the Tilix terminal emulator is looking for a new maintainer. The current dev wants to focus on other things. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is really an incredible opinion editorial here written by Chris Hughes. He sent this to the New York Times. It was published by the New York Times. Chris Hughes is a co-founder of Facebook along with Mark Zuckerberg. But in this op-ed, Chris argues that it's time to break up Facebook, that Facebook has gotten a little too big, and because of all the scandals surrounding Facebook lately, that it's time for the government to step in and break Facebook up as a monopoly. So this is a very lengthy op-ed. I'm just going to hit some of the high points that Chris mentions. He mentions that the company's mistakes, quote, sloppy privacy practices that ended up, getting tens of millions of users' data basically thrown into the lap of a consulting firm, the slow response to Russian agents, violent rhetoric that happens on Facebook often, of course, the charges of fake news. A lot of fake news is spread through social media, including Facebook, and, quote, the unbounded drive to capture ever more of our time and attention. So basically, he's talking about how Facebook really tries to get people addicted, get people hooked to the service. Chris argues that Mark Zuckerberg is one of the most powerful people in the world. I think everybody would agree with that, right? He mentions that that's a problem because, basically his power has not been in check, right? Nobody's really on Facebook. I mean, I guess the U.S. government here lately has been worried about what Facebook is doing, but Mark Zuckerberg's influence over everything that happens in the world is, to quote the article here by Chris Hughes, it's staggering, far beyond that of anyone else in the private sector or in government. Right now, Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp are all owned by the same company, all owned by Zuckerberg. So think about that monopoly right there. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, billions of users every day. Billions every day. Facebook's board works more like an advisory committee than an overseer because Mark controls around 60% of the voting shares. So Zuckerberg basically has total control of the company, right? Nobody can really challenge him. What he says goes. Chris charges that Mark alone decides how to configure Facebook's algorithms, or ultimately it's his decision. He decides the algorithms, he decides what kind of privacy settings are used on Facebook. He sets the rules for pretty much everything related to Facebook and, of course, Instagram and WhatsApp as well. Chris states that he believes Mark Zuckerberg is a good, kind person, but he's a bit disappointed in Mark because, along with Chris, they really did not envision how big Facebook would become, and they never really thought about privacy and security in terms of now, right? Because when they started Facebook, I mean, this was, 15 years back? Back then, they never envisioned how Facebook could, influence elections, for example, or empower nationalistic leaders, how it could basically change culture, how it could shape culture. So in the op-ed, Chris here implores the government, the U.S. government must hold Mark accountable. He says, lawmakers for too long have kind of marveled at Facebook's explosive growth, how, the company just started from nothing and became this gigantic multi-billion-dollar company very quickly. He says any day now, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is expected to impose a large fine on the company because of some of the scandals in recent years. That fine that the FTC is expected to give Facebook is expected to be a $5 billion fine. Now, a $5 billion fine sounds like an insanely huge fine that would cripple most corporations. Facebook will pay that fine and keep going, right? $5 billion to Facebook is a drop in the bucket. And Chris states that, that's not enough. $5 billion will not hurt them in any way. So according to Chris, he really thinks that Congress should step in and think about breaking the company up. Chris writes in the op-ed that we already have the tools needed to fix this problem, the problem of the monopoly of Facebook, the complete domination of Facebook over the internet and social media. Really, America was kind of built on the idea that power should never be concentrated in any one person. Of course, we're talking government, and we're talking also the private sector. So America, we of course had a revolution because we didn't want to be ruled by a king. We wanted basically democracy. We wanted a democratic government. We also don't want a king as far as a king over things like the oil industry, the railroad industry. A century ago, we broke up monopolies. We broke up the big oil and the big steel, big banking. Nowadays, though, it's very uncommon here in the U.S. to actually break up a monopoly. We don't do this kind of thing very often. And that's a problem. I'm not sure. I mean, other than the phone companies, if you guys remember when we broke up the phone companies, that's it. Microsoft had a lawsuit against them, and the U.S. government nearly broke up Microsoft as a monopoly back in the late 90s. But that didn't come to fruition. I don't imagine Facebook will actually be broken up. It's hard to imagine today's government doing much of anything, breaking up a company like Facebook. Now, does Facebook actually meet a definition of a monopoly? I think so. And Chris Hughes, again, co-founder of Facebook, says they meet really the definition of a monopoly. He says because, quote, Facebook so dominates social networking, it faces no market-based accountability. That means that every time Facebook messes up, we repeat an exhausting pattern. First, outrage, then disappointment, and finally, resignation. So basically, Facebook screws up, but you can't really get off of Facebook. There's no alternatives to Facebook. That's what many people think. I can't leave Facebook. All my friends and family are on Facebook. Everybody's on Facebook. So when they screw up in major ways, when they're taking your data and not handling it in an appropriate fashion, yes, you get mad. You get mad at Facebook, you curse them, you're disappointed in them, but finally you're just resigned to the fact, well, what can you do? So Facebook, really, the government probably should seriously consider breaking up Facebook. Really, the minute they bought Instagram and WhatsApp, that should have been a warning sign. Some of the numbers, Facebook's monopoly: about 70% of American adults use social media, and a vast majority of that 70% actually use Facebook products. At least 2/3 of them use the core site, Facebook, a third use Instagram, and a fifth use WhatsApp. By contrast, fewer than a third report using Pinterest, LinkedIn, Snapchat. One of the big problems, of course, is competition. Facebook has no competition, and it's hard to imagine any new up-and-coming competition because the marketplace is not the same as when Facebook was coming up. Now it's much tougher. There's less chance of a startup developing, this healthy, less exploitative social media platform, as an alternative to Facebook. You guys know I love decentralized, federated social networks like Diaspora and especially Mastodon. I think Mastodon's fantastic. You guys that are not subscribed to my Mastodon, check me out on Mastodon, but are they really competitive with Facebook? Are we ever going to see mass adoption of something like Mastodon? I would love it if that happened. Do I think it's going to happen? I would probably bet against it, even though I'm rooting for Mastodon. In closing, I'll say that Chris also mentions that one of the most disturbing aspects of Facebook is the power of Mark Zuckerberg. He has basically unilateral control over speech. And by unilateral control over speech, we're talking about over billions of people. There really is no historical precedent for anybody that has the ability to monitor, organize, or even censor conversations of nearly 2 billion people now on Facebook. So that is just too much power in the hands of one person. And I really kind of blown away by this op-ed again. It's strange. Co-founder of Facebook, Chris Hughes, actually suggesting that the moral thing to do really is it's time to break up Facebook. And the second story on the docket tonight is the news that Microsoft will ship a full Linux kernel in Windows 10. Yeah, this is not your daddy's Microsoft, right? This is a different company, right? Under the leadership of Satya Nadella. This is not the Microsoft I grew up with, in the 80s and 90s. So This article comes from The Verge, and as always, I'm going to link to all the articles discussed on the show today in the show description. Microsoft has surprised many in the Linux community in recent years. Quote, surprises have included things like the Bash shell in Windows, native OpenSSH in Windows 10, and even including Ubuntu, SUSE, and Fedora in the Windows Store. So now with Windows Insider builds this summer, we will now include a in-house custom-built Linux kernel. That new full Linux kernel that is going to be the underpinning of the newest version of the Windows subsystem for Linux. So that kernel, what's it going to be based off of? It's going to be version 4.19. Why 4.19? Because that's the last long-term stable release, so the LTS release of the kernel. The kernel will be rebased at the designation of the new long-term stable releases to ensure that the WSL kernel always has the latest Linux goodness. So this is, a big shift for Microsoft here. It's a big shift, marks the very first time that the Linux kernel, a real Linux kernel, the full Linux kernel, will be included as part of Windows. That's a big deal, right? I mean, Microsoft has been saying that they love Linux, and this is a big step in proving that. It also sounds like Linux now, the kernel integration in Windows 10 is probably going to happen this year. They're not really exactly nailing it down on a date, but probably sometime later this summer, possibly in an update. Well, the update that they're planning for is already codenamed 19H2, but again, we don't know exactly when that will ship. So what does having the full kernel, a real Linux kernel, available to you on Windows 10 mean? Well, for developers, it's going to be huge, right? You can expect drastic improvement of performance of Microsoft's Linux subsystem in Windows, because now that's the real kernel. That's actual Linux. So, it should basically handle anything you would expect the Linux kernel to handle. So Microsoft is promising to update the kernel through the Windows updates. And of course, the kernel is open source, and the kernel is licensed under the GPL, and Microsoft says they plan on keeping their kernels fully open source, with the ability for developers to create their own Windows subsystem for Linux kernel and contribute changes. So this is just, one more story, one more bit of evidence that Microsoft really is serious about Linux and open source. They keep saying that they're all in on open source. They're really on the open source train with the rest of us, and I'm starting to believe it too. I think we've seen enough of Microsoft now to think they're real about, when they have these banners up here that says Microsoft loves Linux and Microsoft loves open source and Microsoft loves Git or whatever it is. Yes, I'm starting to buy into that. I think this is not the same company as when it was under the leadership of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. And the third story on the docket tonight is that the code name for Ubuntu 19.10 has been revealed. And oh boy, is this one of the most obscure names for a Linux release ever. Certainly, probably the most obscure name for any Ubuntu release. So this will, of course, be the E release. So we have to have an adjective plus an animal, both starting with E. So we just had D with Disco Dingo, which was fantastic. Love the name. Loved everything about that release. It was a great release. I like the artwork. Love the name. This I'm not that fond of, though. So what is the name? The name is Eoan Ermine. Now, some of you are going, what the hell is Eoan and what the hell is Ermine? I actually had to look up Ermine. I've got to be honest. I have no idea what the hell Ermine is. Eoan, I had some clue about what it was, although Eoan is not a word you see that often. Here in the OMG Ubuntu article, by the way, this article comes from Joey Snedden over at OMG Ubuntu. He writes that the first word here, Eoan, the adjective, is actually, the definition for it is of or relating to the dawn. It's not a common word. You don't see it much in use, but it does occasionally pop up in poetry. That's where you see the word most often. And that, of course, those of you that play Scrabble and other word games, it is a valid Scrabble answer as well. It's actually, a dictionary word, so you're good on the Scrabble. But it's only half the code name, right? What is Ermine? Ermine, I had to just look for a picture. There it is. Cute animal, right? It's a weasel. Right? That's all it is. It's really just a weasel. I guess it's a formal name. I don't know if it's a Latin name or, scientific name, or if it's like a colloquial name. But to me, here in the U.S., I'd just call that a weasel. or maybe some people would just call it a rat even. It's an elongated rat, though it's a weasel, guys. So Mark Shuttleworth, he was the one that usually reveals the new code names, and he, again, was the one that revealed Eoan Ermine. He revealed it in a blog post. What do I think about the name? I think this is a strange name. It's a strange adjective, although I don't mind, throwing out an adjective that's not something most people use in daily speech, because then it gets people going to the dictionary, maybe adding that, that speech, adding that word to their lexicon. I don't mind that, but the Ermine, that's kind of a strange animal. With E, you had all kinds of really cool E names you could have went to. You could have went with Emu. I think that would have been a solid name. And of course, eagle. Everybody loves the eagle. Here in the article, by the way, Joey Snedden goes on about ermines. Their fur apparently is valued. It is used to line the robes of peers who sit in the British House of Lords. So those of you that are anti-fur, though, probably don't appreciate that animal apparently it is valuable, at least the hide of that animal, although the one in the picture looks pretty cute. I would actually feel bad about wearing that. And the fourth story on the docket tonight. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella. He recently visited the Red Hat Summit. Again, more Microsoft news. I don't want this to be like a Microsoft infomercial on how Microsoft has completely changed their ways, and we all should start embracing Microsoft, those of us that are Linux enthusiasts. But this is kind of an important story. So Satya Nadella, he went to the Red Hat Summit. Now, why did he go to the Red Hat Summit? Well, he wanted to announce an official partnership between Red Hat and Microsoft. Apparently, the new joint venture they're doing is Azure, Red Hat, OpenShift. What is that? Well, as you might guess, Azure is Microsoft's Azure. And then OpenShift, I think, is Red Hat's Kubernetes platform. So I guess basically a partnership between those particular programs. But I think the real story here is just the optics of it, right? James Whitehurst, the CEO of Red Hat, at one point introduced Satya Nadella. Satya Nadella walked on stage, on the same stage that there was Jim Whitehurst. That's not something you would see every day. Again, Microsoft loves Linux, right? This is not Steve Ballmer, who famously, spouted Linux is a cancer. So why was Nadella there? Again, he wanted to announce this new partnership between Azure and OpenShift, but he really was there to quote Nadella, quote, "We have to be a bit more humble and say, okay, how do we bring value to the table with great technologies coming from a lot of places?" Basically, he just wanted to be a part of the community, right? Also, when he talks about being more humble, of course, Microsoft is a gigantic company, almost $1 trillion company. It may be worth $1 trillion by now. I don't know. I haven't looked at what they're valued at here lately, but Microsoft is a gigantic company. But I think it's fantastic that the CEO of that company is at basically a Linux summit. Jim Whitehurst, CEO of Red Hat, he thought it was pretty amazing that Satya Nadella was at the summit because, according to him, 5 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. There was a real adversarial relationship between Microsoft and Linux and the free and open source software communities at large. So to quote Whitehurst, quote, "It's just amazing to see how much progress we've had together, and I think that's on both sides, and both desire to serve our customers, and we have found such a great range to work together." Again, speaking on the new Red Hat OpenShift Azure partnership. A bit more about the partnership. Microsoft and Red Hat, they're collaborating to bring their customers containerized solutions for RHEL 8, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, on Azure. Also, Red Hat Ansible Engine 2.8 and Ansible certified modules. That's all well and good. I'm sure the joint venture that they had announced is worthy news. But of course, again, the real news was Satya Nadella. He was at a Linux conference. Satya Nadella and Jim Whitehurst were on stage. They shook hands. Again, this is not your father's Microsoft. It's a strange new world we're in. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight is the news that the Tilix terminal emulator is looking for a new maintainer. So I came across this a couple of days ago over on Reddit. Somebody posted over at r/Linux a link to this GitHub post. So this is, of course, the Tilix GitHub page. And the main dev, G91, opened this issue here, looking for a new maintainer. And basically, he is announcing that he's tired of maintaining Tilix. He is not really all that interested in adding new features to Tilix or even maintaining Tilix. He has other interests in life now. And this is common. As a matter of fact, this is very common. Somebody creates a project. They work on it for months, sometimes years, sometimes decades. But eventually, they get tired of working on this project. They want to move on to something else. They no longer want to maintain the project. They certainly oftentimes don't want to be the sole maintainer of the project. So this guy, he says, you know what, he has a job that really doesn't involve terminal emulators or graphical user environments of any kind. It doesn't involve the D programming language, which is what he wrote Tilix in. So he really doesn't want to fool with Tilix anymore, and he's taking it to the community. Hey, guys, does one of you guys want to step up and become the maintainer of Tilix and keep this project alive? People have actually answered the call a little bit in the post, but most of them, the tough part here is that it's written in D. I mean, the very first comment, hey, I write Python and C. I'm a regular Linux user. Yeah, but Tilix is written in D. The fact that you know C, probably not going to help you. I don't know if they've already found somebody that is willing to do this and that the current dev is actually willing to hand the keys over to just yet. But again, any of you guys that appreciate the Tilix terminal emulator, which is a fine terminal emulator, I've actually installed it and played with it a little bit in the past. If you know the D programming language, I know that's kind of a tough one. Not a lot of people out there know D, but if you're kind of big into D, you're a D guru, and you want something as maybe a side project, to help you sharpen your D programming skills. Maybe you want to put something on the resume. Take a look at the Tilix terminal emulator, because right now, the main dev, he's looking for somebody. He wants to hand the keys off to somebody. Joey Snedden over at OMG Ubuntu, he has a write-up on the situation with Tilix here, also about the main dev, putting out the call that he's looking for somebody to replace him. But Joey also goes into more of the broader aspect of a lot of devs get burnt out, or they just get tired of the projects they're working on, or most devs are working based solely off of passion. They have a passion for the project they're working on, or they're using it as a way to expand or sharpen their skills, maybe to pad a resume at some point. But these are not like, you're working on passion, but it's not a lifelong passion. Things change in life. You're ready to move on to something else. What happens to those projects? Well, free software doesn't die just because the developer decides to abandon it or leave or what have you, or even, tragically passes away or whatever happens. It's free software. It's licensed under a free license. It's always out there. So it's not like the software just goes away, but it's nice to have a maintainer, somebody to fix the bugs as they crop up, because as things sit there without a main dev, eventually bugs creep in. That's the way it happens. Eventually it gets to the point where that project is no longer usable. Anyway, the call is out there, so any of you guys, if you want to take up this project, it's out there. Go get it. The community would really appreciate it. Those of you that don't know anything about Tilix as a terminal emulator, it's in everybody's repos. Install it, check it out. I often have people ask me about what's your favorite terminal emulator, and this, that, they're all fine. But Tilix, if you haven't checked it out, it's worth checking out. Again, I've played with it a little bit in the past. It is a fine terminal emulator. And that was the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. This was Taking Into Account, episode 41. Now, I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account sometime every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 42 sometime next Thursday. As always, I try to end these episodes by reading a viewer question or comment. Often these viewer questions or comments come from over on Mastodon. Sometimes they come from the YouTube comments, sometimes through email, sometimes from Reddit, just wherever. I've been getting, of course, a lot of questions this past week about my new job. Many of you guys know I made a video recently. I will be changing jobs soon. What does this mean for the channel? I actually think it might be good for the channel. I'm going to work more hours, actually, at the job I'm going to, but there will be more regular hours. I will have it like a set schedule so I can actually plan things, so I can plan channel stuff where I couldn't really at my last job because my schedule was never the same week to week. It was this constant rotating schedule. Never knew what days of the week I was working, whether I was working mornings, evenings, nights. Now it will be a much more set schedule. It will be just a typical 5-day work week, but it will be like the same hours basically the same schedule every week. So it will be a little bit more regular, hopefully, for the YouTube channel as well. I will, right now, even making these taking into account episodes can be tough. Making today's episode was a little tough for me because I actually worked all day at, again, the job I'm leaving until almost 7 o'clock at night. And then I'm trying to record taking into account episode 41 in the evening. It often takes me, about an hour to record, then about an hour or longer sometimes to edit. It's going to have to probably render for an hour. Then I've got to upload it to YouTube, and then I've got to, make all the show notes for the YouTube post and the timestamps and everything. I need a block of about 3 to 4 hours just to make these taking into account episodes every day. And you can imagine, on the days where like I work a 9 or a 10-hour shift and it's in the middle of the day, like a 10 to 7 at night kind of shift. It is hard. What do I take that 4-hour block really early in the morning and get up like daylight or even before daylight, or do I do it very late in the evening like I'm doing now? Well, now that I have kind of a regular schedule, I'll be able to plan these things out a little bit better. Hopefully get a little more rest than I've been getting lately. So I'm actually looking forward to starting my new job next week. Again, it shouldn't affect the channel. If anything, I think it will be better as far as the channel. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Chris, the other Chris, Douglas, Dylan, Leor, Philip, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They're the producers of the show, my highest tiered patrons. Without these guys, taking into account episode 41 would not have been possible. The show was also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen. You guys see that long list of names that help support my work over on Patreon. Again, without each and every one of those fine ladies and gentlemen, this show would not be possible. I want to sincerely thank each and every one of them. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.